Welcome to the City Rev Life podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy, and I'm with Pastor Craig.
Hey.
We're going to be in a series where we're going to be talking about relationships, dating, marriage.
Yep.
And it's a bit of an interesting one, Craig.
Yeah.
A bit of an interesting one. So as far as what the topics will be in, it's going to be about should dating couples live together? Should you marry somebody from another faith?
Yeah.
For the sake of today, we'll be talking about the first topic, which is should dating couples live together? And I mean, before we answer the question, if you don't mind, Craig, why do couples live together?
So we hear this a lot, right? This is common in the church. This is something that I feel like for a long time people have known, like, hey, the Christian faith, according to the Bible, it's not wise. It's not recommended for couples to live together. But we get a lot of pushback on it, right? Because it makes a lot of sense for a lot of people, at least up front, at least logically, right? So they say, hey, a couple's in a committed dating relationship, and it's a lot simpler financially a lot of times for couples to say, well, we'll just, live together. It's smarter. We don't have to pay two rents now. We can just pay one rent, save money, right? You have that argument. A lot of it too is that people who are dating like to spend time together, right? And it's no fun when you're, in a loving dating relationship and you're, eating dinner together and spending time together, and then one of you's got to go home, right? You got to go drive across town and you got to go to your apartment, and a lot of people just, miss that time with one another. And so those are a couple big ones. I think in our culture too, there's this view that living together before marriage is kind of the next step for a dating relationship. I think that's the normal view, right? Like a lot of couples will start dating one another, and then when it gets serious, they'll live together. That's like the trial period, right? Where they're going to try it out. They're going to see if they enjoy being together. The thinking is, do we enjoy living together? Does it work well? Living together, does it work well? And then if that goes well, then maybe we'll get engaged and maybe we'll get married down the line. But it's just that next logical step for a lot of people when they think through their dating relationships these days.
Now, is that the right thing to do?
So for a long, long, long time, Christians have taught that couples shouldn't live together before they're married. That's been the common practice, the wisdom from the biblical principles that we see, from just the teaching of the church historically. We know that for a long time, right? Couples shouldn't live together before they get married. I think the big question is why, right? Like what's the reasoning behind it, right? Other than just like, why? Like, is it just for a long time it was like, oh, it's kind of like taboo and just the society looked down upon it. Things have changed now. It's not really the case now, but there's still good reasons that the Bible teaches us of why couples shouldn't live together. And really what comes to mind, the primary verse that comes to mind for me is in 1 Corinthians 6:18. The Apostle Paul writes for Christians that we are to flee from sexual immorality. And he says, every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. And I think that wording there is really important, because when you read, especially in the New Testament, when you read about sexual sin, the words are intense, the words are cautious, the words are strong, like this, like flee from sexual immorality. This is stronger than just avoid sexual immorality or stay away from, but flee, run from it, right? And there's other verses that have this kind of language. And the idea that the Apostle Paul is pushing is that this is really, really important for a Christian to avoid. Sexual immorality is really important for a Christian to avoid. And so his advice is to flee from it, right? And so when we think about fleeing from sexual immorality, really the heart behind it that I think the Apostle Paul is saying, and you can see it from other verses like that passage in James where it talks about temptation, right, is this idea that we are to run from sexual temptation. And this is probably the biggest warning and the biggest reason why Christians advise other Christians to not live together before you get married, is because it's really hard to flee from sexual immorality when you are living together and you're sleeping in the same home, and maybe even for some couples sleeping in the same bed, right? Yeah. And like still trying to be Christian, still trying to do it, but still trying to hold that, sexual ethic of saving themselves for marriage, but then living in the same place makes it really difficult to do that, because there's just not a lot of barriers or obstacles in your way for pursuing sexual immorality. So the Apostle Paul says we should flee from sexual immorality, and one of the reasons why couples should live apart before they get married is that it adds a little bit of a barrier, a buffer, and some obstacles in the way of sexual morality, and it's for the sake of your own soul, right?
Yeah.
Like don't get yourself entangled in something. Make it more difficult for you to indulge in sin. That's just a good Christian practice, right? And so living apart helps that, right?
Yeah. I have a question though, because the Apostle Paul is making a clear command to flee from sexual morality. And then he says, every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. And I don't think he's saying that sexual sin is technically worse than any other sin, but it does have a different effect. Whereas a lie, which would come out from your mouth to another individual, wouldn't have an effect internally, but in the way that it's put here, sexual sin infects you from the inside out.
Yeah.
What would that look like?
So we know that all sin is destructive, right? And one of the real beauties of Scripture, and one of the some of the wisdom behind the Scriptures, is that God protects us from sin, partly because of the way that it protects our society as a whole, right? So when you think of like the moral commandments, like the 10 Commandments, right? And you think about how, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not lie, right? We can see how if people were to commit those sins, right? Murder, theft, lying, that it would have a destructive impact on the community, right? Like, how could you have a society if people were just doing all that all the time, right? Like, you couldn't function together. A community couldn't work together. And so a lot of it's to protect the community. And when we talk about sexual immorality, there's some of that, like protecting other people, protecting their heart, protecting their body, protecting families, protecting children. Like, part of that is why sexual immorality is a sin and is warned against so strongly. But also what's interesting about sexual immorality is that there is a deeply destructive personal effect on our lives, right? And so we think of like, some of the old cases, right? Like you think about like sexual transmitted diseases, things like that, right? Like there's harmful, like you're exposing your body to maybe something harmful in a partner, but also just the mental aspect and the guilt and the shame that comes from it, right? There's like a lot of parts where sexual immorality affects you personally, even more than just the community. So I think the Apostle Paul is worried about that too, right? So he's warning us of these things, not just because he wants us to not have fun, or he wants us to pay 2 rents or to be difficult, right? But he's warning us of these things because all of the holiness codes in Scripture are trying to lead us to a better way and a better life. And so what the Apostle Paul is really getting at is, for the sake of the believer, for the sake of your soul, like this is better to flee sexual immorality. This is better for you. That's what he's pushing and calling Christians to live holy for, because it's a better way, a better path.
So what I'm hearing is that, when sex is taken outside of its proper context, which is in the confines of marriage between a husband and a wife, it causes harm to individuals who are practicing it, who are not married to each other, who are not committed to each other in that way.
Yeah, it certainly complicates things, and likely it will likely cause harm. I think that sex is a good thing given from God. It's a gift from God. And sexual desire was put into people naturally, right? It's a good thing given God, but it was designed for marriage, right? Designed for a purpose, right? So designed to drive a husband and wife together, designed to create families, designed to create a bond that would protect children, right? When you take all these things outside of marriage, it causes a lot of complications. And not to say that God can't redeem those things or work through that, because there's messy families that God works in, and he helps people, and his grace, sufficient. But it's just thinking like, okay, well, what's the ideal? The ideal would be, hey, this is something that is saved, protected for marriage, and it's a good thing, a blessing for that marriage, and then for the family that it creates. That's really what we think God's design and intention was for sex.
Yeah. So God, in creating sex for marriage, and not for just anybody, not just to be practiced in leisure. He put that in. He put that commandment in to protect us,
Yeah.
like as guardrails,
Yeah.
not to deprive us or keep us from something good. But if this is to happen, not only correctly but in the best way, it needs to be in the proper
Yeah,
con.
it needs to be in the proper order, and also I think there's a little bit of a sanity check on our culture as well, where sex has become such, if I can use the word idol, but just such an important thing for so
Yeah,
many people in their life, and really the driving thing for so many people, especially young people in our world, right? Like sex is a motivating factor for many things in their life. Like okay, I gotta have a good car, I gotta have a good job, I gotta have a good image, like I gotta be on these dating apps, I gotta meet these people. So like it all kind of drives and points to, so I can meet someone, and so it can lead to this, right?
mm,
And I think the Bible brings some wisdom there of saying, hey, like sex is a good thing given from God, but it's not the most important
yeah,
thing in your life, right? Like there's bigger things in life too, right? The following of God, the love of God, the worship of God, the service of neighbor, the love of your family, like building something important in your life and in your community. And when sex kind of becomes the most important thing in your life, and your life is for sex, it can mess things up, right?
yeah,
It just turns the path and direction of your life off course, and it's hard to compete and like seek after God's will when we're just seeking. It's like you cannot serve two masters, God and money, right? It's almost like in our culture that's still relevant, God and money, but it's almost like you cannot serve two masters, God and sex, right? Like
yeah.
you need to keep that really in check and in a sane part
Yeah.
of your life.
And I remember you saying how like um living together, couples living
Yeah,
together, it's prioritized as like a, oh, like this is kind of like segueing into marriage. This is
yeah,
like preparation, like testing the waters kind
right.
of. And if let's say if that is put into practice, like does it actually work long term?
It doesn't, and that's what's really interesting. So couples that live together actually are more likely to get divorced than couples that don't. And there's a lot of factors that go into this, and the research actually has been changing as culture's been changing. And so you'll read, if you Google it, you'll read some articles about like, hey, living together actually improves your odds of marriage. It's not true. The research is saying that living together slightly improves your odds of staying together that first year of marriage. So like the first year one, you're more likely to stay together if you live together. But after that, for every succeeding year, couples that live together before marriage are more likely to get divorced than couples that didn't, right? And there's a lot of factors that go into that, right? So a couple that maybe holds off on living together is very countercultural. So they're probably Christians, or they're probably following something bigger than themselves, right? And so then when they do get together, there's probably a deeper commitment to one another, and a deeper resistance to divorce. But I think there's also just a psychological element of it too, of like, hey, well, we live together and we're like roommates, and now the court system has said we're husband and wife, and ending my marriage seems to be just like a little bit slightly more complicated way than maybe ending my lease with my roommate, right? And that's not the design, right? Like I think there is something good and healthy about a marriage and a couple joining together, waiting until marriage to live together, because there's also just like a day-to-day psychological daily life change that happens that reminds you constantly, oh, I'm married now, like I'm committed to this person. Whereas when that's just regular for you, and then you go get married, I think it might be harder to see the change and see the impact that marriage has on your day-to-day life when you've already been living with that person. Again, not to say God can't redeem that. There's a lot of couples that live together and they find the Lord, and they want to be obedient to Him, and they decide to get married, and like God blesses that and
Yeah.
loves that, and that's honoring to Him, right? That's a good thing. But I'm saying, if you have the choice and you're following after Jesus and walking with Him, why not do the wise thing, right? Why not hold off and refrain and give yourself a better chance, saying, hey, I want this marriage to be successful. I want to hold off
Mm.
and not live together before we get married, because I want to be married to this person for the rest of my life, right? So I want to increase those odds as much as I can.
Yeah. In that way, it sounds like that person is putting the Lord first above that relationship, and
Yeah.
putting the
Yeah.
other individual's self-interest like before themselves. So with with um with this in mind, because as far as like the different reasons as like why couples would want to live with each other,
Yeah.
and also seeing its effects if going through it long term, um, where it's more of like a like searching for compatibility and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
what if there's a different motive involved in like, hey, like I come from an abusive house. My relationship with my parents isn't the best. It could be physical, it could be verbal, but it's just either one or the other individual. Like they just can't have it at their own house.
Yeah.
And so this is the safest option for them. But they're not married, they're Christians, and this is what it opens the door to. So it kind of sounds like they're in the middle. They're like at a crossroads of.
Yeah, and my heart goes out to those kind of couples, right? With like legitimate reasons, whether it be that like, hey, I'm not safe at my home, or just talking to couples that, like I remember talking to a couple where one partner was in the military, right? And so they're like, well, we want to like be together, and we want to try to be near each other, and it just doesn't make sense, right? Like we want to still honor God, but we're just going to live in the same house and the same roof. And I think for all those, all the situations, right? My heart goes out to it, and it seems like an easy solution. But I would say we would need to fight back or push back on the simple, easy solution for the sake of honoring God and for the sake of our witness, right, to the outside world. And so Ephesians 5:3 says, but sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among the saints, right? And there's this idea, other verses talk about how Christians are to live above reproach and to have a good reputation and a good witness in the world. And when a couple's living together, especially like a Christian couple's living together, there's going to be an assumption of sexual immorality. Like that's just the default. People you meet on the street are going to assume that that's what's happening in your home, even if it's not, right? Even if it's not fair. And for the sake of our commitment to the Lord, and for the sake of our witness, and for the sake of like standing out, right? This is one of those issues where I think as Christians we're called to stand out, not fit in, right? And so for the sake of being a little bit weird and to change that conversation at work and open up the door to have conversations about your values and how your life is different and how you're salt and light in the world, I think it would be worth you looking into other options before you lived with your girlfriend or your boyfriend, right? Like for that couple that you're talking about, say, hey, like it's not safe at home, or for a couple that's saying, hey, financially we just can't make it work. There are other options, right? Like you don't have to say, hey, I'm going to go live with my boyfriend or my girlfriend, right? There are other people out there who need roommates. There are other safe living environments. I know it's hard. I know it's challenging, right? Like it's not as easy, not as comfortable. You got to deal with, finding a roommate, finding a place. It's a lot of work. I know that, but there are other options. And so I think it kind of is a little bit unfair to say, well, this is my only option. Like, so this is all I can do. I couldn't live at home, so I need to live with them. Like there are other options in place there, right? And when we go through the effort of saying, hey, finding roommates or finding another place to live, and you're talking, especially as you get closer to marriage, right? Like, and you're engaged and you're talking to people at your workplace, and they're like, yeah, I was going over to my fiance's house, this weekend. They're like, oh, you guys don't live together, right? It provides those openings. It provides a chance for conversations for people to say, why? Like, why are you guys not just living together, right? It provides opportunities for you to witness and share your faith and say, hey, I don't because I'm a Christian. Here's why, here's what's going on in my life. And just to open that door a little bit to have those conversations about your faith. That's a real life witness that we can have just through our lifestyle, just through living faithfully and trying to be obedient to godly principles and biblical principles in our life.
Yeah, it like kind of helps us stand out in a way.
Yeah.
And not in like an arrogant like connotation, but just like it makes more room for another person to see Christ through us and in our relationship.
Yeah, it's like when it's similar to like being involved in a church. I feel like it's very countercultural these days, right? Or to give your time to a ministry, right? Like I think about like we're in student ministry all the time, and those people who tell their coworkers, hey, I got to leave today, at 5 because I got to get to my church and volunteer with the student ministry, right? Like that's it's kind of like that, where people are like, what? Like, what do you do? You know, why are you doing that? And it gives an open door to share about your faith and how your life is a little different from the rest of the world, and in a good way, right? These are good things. Like, God blesses them, you know? I think overall, what we see in society is that just marriage is becoming less important, right? Like, I just, like, fewer people are getting married, more and more people are delaying marriage. Like, there's a lot of people living together without being married, a lot of people living together starting families without getting married, right? And it just doesn't seem to be very important for a lot of people. But marriage is really important to God. Like, it's very important to him. And so I think for us as Christians, as we try to live according to God's word and live like Jesus, that if something's really important to God, then it should be really important to us, right? You think about even just the beginning of the Bible. Adam and Eve were created, and God says married. like they were husband and wife. They weren't just man and woman. They were husband and wife. And so even before the church existed, even before the law existed, marriage existed, right? Like, it's like at the beginning. Yeah. And there's one verse that really jumped out to me as we were thinking through this and thinking through what we were going to say. And it's Hebrews 13:4, that Hebrews 13:4 says, let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. Like, marriage is important to God. That vow that we make to one another, the Bible says, is a reflection of Christ's love for the church. And I think that's why it's so important and near and dear to God, because it is one of his greatest object lessons in our society and in our world, is that the love and commitment between a husband and wife is a reflection of the love and commitment that God's trying to show the world, of a reflection of his love and commitment towards his people. And so for us, I think as Christians, we're kind of put in this weird space of where marriage is becoming less important in the world around us. But for us, because we honor God and because we love God and because it's so important to God, it should be important to us. So we should try to handle it with care.
Handle it with care, and also handle it in the way that he desires, because he designed it.
Yeah.
And I feel like we've answered this question throughout our conversation, but I'm just thinking, like, what? Let's say there's a person
Yeah.
Who's a Christian, and he or she says, like, you know, if sex is the way to seal the bond, to seal the covenant, why do I need to get married? Like,
Right.
like I can say in my own heart that I am committed to this person for life. Why does it need to be documented? Why do I need to have it in a room full of people? Why do I have to have the traditional, like, wedding type of thing? Like, why can't I just be reliant on the fact that on our consensual commitment to each other?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a legitimate question. It's kind of funny. You read about, like, Christians maybe 30, 40 years ago, and they talk about, like, you know, why do I need to go get married in the church when I can just go to the courthouse and do it, right? And now you have, like, people saying, like, why do I need to get married at all, right? But then if you're a Christian, maybe it's, well, why don't I just get married at church and then not worry about, you know, going to the courthouse, you know, like doing that. And I would think that it's all kind of changed a little bit, right? But at the heart of it, again, is that marriage is really important to God, right? And we see throughout Scripture, even early on, right? Like, we see that there are, even in Genesis, that there are stories about sex, and then there are stories about marriages, and they're not the same thing. There's clearly sex outside of marriage, even in the book of Genesis, right? So, like, even like Noah, like, we see it in Noah, right? Like, even in some of the sons of Israel, right? We see it in Judah's life, right? Like, we see, like, there's sex outside of marriage, that there is a commitment and a covenant made between people. We don't have in the Bible, we don't see, like, a marriage ceremony like the one we have today, where we get together and we say vows. We don't see a description of that. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen in some form back then, right? But there was clearly some sort of intention and some sort of public knowledge when a couple was married
together.
Yeah. And then we see in the New Testament, especially, that there is this commitment that a couple makes before God, that this is a godly institution. This is a God-protected and God-honored institution. And so for us, I think it is right and fitting for us to acknowledge that we are making a commitment before God. And I think, again, you're just thinking, like, wisdom and practicality, it's an honorable too, right? These same things, like it protects your witness and it shows the outside world that you've made a commitment to one another to make a public recognition of your marriage, right? So I'm not saying you have to have a big wedding like we do these days. I'm not even saying it has to follow all the American traditions, right? Like you got to do this dance or have this music or even say these certain kinds of vows, right? But I think there has to be at the core of it an acknowledgement of a commitment and a vow before God between these two people to reflect Christ's love of the church, right? Like I'm going to love my wife and the wife's going to love the husband the way that Christ loves the church. Like this is a reflection of it, right? This is what scripture says. So there needs to be an acknowledgement of that. And then for the sake of the people around us, for the sake of fleeing sexual immorality, for the sake of our public witness, all right, let's make a public declaration of that. So it could be at a courthouse. I'm okay with that. It could be, you go get some documents signed, right? But at least it's a public thing of saying, hey, like we are, by our state, by our government, in our neighborhood, like we're married, like we're official.
There's a sense of like accountability too.
Yeah, there's a sense of accountability there too. You're right. And then you get into the practicalities too of just like protections in a marriage relationship. Like there's a reason why a lot of these laws exist around marriage, because it protects both parties. And so I just say it's a good idea. It's good advice, good wisdom, right? To get married in the church and make sure you're legally married too. That's a good thing. Like it's going to be for your benefit.
Yeah. So with everything that we've said, like what's like one like nugget you don't want to share to the audience?
I would just say if
because we did talk about a lot.
We did talk about a lot. But if you're a couple, a dating couple, and you're thinking about living together, especially if you're Christians, right? My heart to you would be there's a lot of practical reasons and maybe even logical reasons for you to think like, hey, we want to live together first. But that when you give your life to Jesus, to Christ, right? Your everything in your life, right, is subservient to following and honoring God, right? Even your living situation and your dating relationships, your sexual ethic, all that stuff is secondary or tertiary, like behind and below following after God and honoring God in your life. And so as you're making all the decisions in your life, right, you got to think, okay, well, what will honor God the most, right? What decision can I make? Which of these decisions will honor God the most in how I live my life? And I would think if you weigh that in whether you should live with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, like you'll see like, no, I want to honor God. I want to protect my witness. I want to honor the marriage bed. It means a lot to him. So it's going to mean a lot to me. So I would just say, hey, if that's your focus, man, we've given it all. We've surrendered it all to him. Let's continue to even surrender our dating relationships to him in the process.
Yeah. It's acknowledging that commitment, and everything else being, like you said, in submission to him.
Yeah.
Because our lives are first his. And, it's both like honoring to him, and it also works in our favor where we're protected. The other individual's protected. Our witness is protected. Yeah. So I think that's really important. Thank you, Craig, for sharing that. Well, guys, we'll see you back on the next episode of the City Rev Life podcast. See you soon.
Thank you so much for listening to the City Rev Life podcast. Feel free to subscribe or leave a rate and review. If you want more content or additional resources, head to cityrev.org or download our app. We hope you have a great day.